I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Michael Hicks. Before I do that, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us today. A lot of smiling faces out there. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Hicks. I'd never met him before, but I'm a great admirer of his work. I really like his writings, and I'm going to lift a couple of those out just before my introduction. But I have a short bio. He's a modest man because he could have sent a long list of material, but he said, I like to keep it short, and I think you'll see his message is very valuable. It'll bespeak his academic accomplishments. Michael Hicks is George and Francis Ball Distinguished Professor of Economics and Director of Center for Business and Economic Research at Ball State University. He has held faculty positions at the Air Force Institute of Technology, Marshall University, and the University of Tennessee. His research has been reported in places such as The Economist, The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, Vanity Fair, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and the Washington Post. And I like this one, and I think one of his most admirable accomplishments. Michael is a retired infantry soldier in the Army Reserve with peacekeeping and combat service in the Middle East and Africa. We thank you for your service. I just wanted to lift a couple pieces out of some published work that he had, maybe to allow him to kick this off. We discussed this. In the first one, this will sound familiar to many readers, but we all have a familiarity bias in assessing our own communities. I continue to be amazed at the number of educated folks who live in places that have been shrinking for 4, 5, or 6 decades, yet remain wholly unknowing of these facts. So the first big challenge of places facing economic decline is to recognize that truth. Cities and counties that are shrinking need to confront facts about themselves before they can make any progress. The second one is just a sentence, and I like this because it dilutes it down to its very essence, and he and I were discussing this. In terms of major long-term prospects, the only thing that will turn places around is to attract more people, or at least end the population decline. So with that, no further ado, a warm welcome, Dr. Hicks.
I didn't know I was going to get quoted on what I wrote earlier, so I'm glad you got the good comments here. It's good to be with you all. I appreciate what you're trying to do here, and what I'd like to do today is to talk about what economists call quality of life. You all call it quality of place. We've called it primacy of place. It means sort of the same thing, so don't get caught up on the words. Whatever sounds good to you, do it. And I'm really bad at this sort of naming of things. And I'm going to talk to you first about what I think a lot of places, how they view this, and why I think that's probably an incomplete way to do so. And then I'm going to talk about how, why it's a problem very briefly. And then I'm going to talk a lot about how economists measure quality of life. It'll be a little bit technical to you, but I think I got a couple of keys in there that'll make it make sense. And then I'm going to talk about why quality of life matters, how it affects population growth, how it affects employment growth, how it affects GDP growth, how it affects growth of new businesses. Because it's been a fairly substantial change in the way the world works, and I'll talk about that in terms of labor markets and where people choose to live. Then I'll talk a little bit about things that I think don't matter that often enter the conversation in terms of quality of life, things that are not showing promise in terms of turning around places like Richmond or Muncie or Terre Haute or Dubuque, Iowa, or elsewhere. And then I'll end with some just a sort of pull out some lessons from this that I think are important, so that it's not the usefulness of economics in this is that it pulls out some lessons. We're able to tease out some lessons about what quality of life means that have broader applications. So I'll show you some things that are happening in labor markets that suggest that the same policies that would make your place more attractive to other people would also make it more attractive to businesses, would make it more attractive for and boost incomes, and that the things that you're trying to do, whether or not they're in housing or education as well, could generate growth in those areas. So that the quality of life, what I'll end with is the quality of life the things about your community that make people want to live here are the root cause. The absence of that is a root cause of almost all the other problems that you have. That if you can fix that, if you can work on that stuff, almost all the other things that you're trying to fix will take care of themselves. That's the big point of this. So here's a common narrative. A common narrative about quality of life or quality of place is that mobile talent or mobile people, mostly college graduates or people with some college experience, people with a really good technical trade, are the mobile population in America. People with just a high school diploma or less, 90+% of them live and die within 40 or 50 miles of where they were born. So there's very little mobility anymore of people who have a high school degree or less. And the reason for that is labor demand shocks don't affect them. There's always plenty of jobs if you're willing to work for $13 an hour. So bad times don't really affect those folks. It's really higher income households, people who are better educated, are highly mobile. And then if you make a place interesting through some government investment or nonprofit investment, or you get the right businesses in your area that create recreation, or you got a nifty bar scene, that will attract that talent to your location, and then you could start attracting businesses. That the consequence of attracting these people will cause you to be able to attract businesses to your community, and these are the workers that you need. But this shouldn't be about attracting businesses, and here's why. This is a graphic of the cumulative job growth in the United States. And there are two types of jobs here. There's jobs that you can attract. I call them footloose jobs or attractable jobs. Those are jobs that involve making something or producing a service that is exported outside of your region. So making a car part, producing a movie or television, doing back office financial services, teaching a class to an MBA student online. Those are all exportable jobs. You're providing a good or service that's sold outside of your region. And the other type of jobs are the non-attractable jobs. Those are the jobs that depend on local demand. The school teacher, the firefighter, the restaurateur, the physician, anybody who's doing something to provide a local service. So the United States has been a job creation machine since the 1970s, so now that's 52 years of data here. We've created 110 million jobs for the non-attractable jobs. We've created less, they're negative 1.8 million attractable jobs. So your business attraction efforts, your efforts to lure a business to your community through tax incentives, through low taxes, through infrastructure, by building a tech park, by doing anything like that, you're chasing this. And that's okay. It'd be great if you could catch it. It's fine. It's great to have those. The problem is, chasing this is very expensive. It's terribly expensive. It involves typically broad tax abatements. Here in Indiana, we spend about $1 billion a year on tax abatements of some type to lure businesses to our community. We've done that for 20 years or long, really 50 years, but I have good data going back 20 years. We have fewer businesses in Indiana today than we did 20 years ago. So that's not working. But if you're typically communities reduce resources that could attract these types of jobs, and they divert it to attracting these types of jobs. So they're taking money out of the tax pot that will go to schools that would appeal to these people. They take the money out of tax dollars that would repair roads or public infrastructure. They take tax dollars away from activities that would improve the quality of public services. right? They shift the tax burden from these businesses to these businesses. So the average business in Indiana pays about 7% of their gross domestic product in taxes to Indiana. The average manufacturing firm pays about 2%, which is lower than a single mom earning $29,000 a year with 2 kids. Right, so I like factory. I'm a retired soldier. I like the smell of cordite and diesel fumes and asphalt. I love it. But if you're trying to build a community and you're chasing those with tax dollars, this is the disappointment you should prepare for. If you're moving resources from these, trying to attract these jobs and making a place that these people would like to move to a place where these people would like to move, you're making a mistake. Now let's look at this county. This is the Richmond Micropolitan Statistical Area, right? It's a new statistical designation. It's this county. So these are the attractable jobs since 1970. And these are the non-attractable jobs. So all of the quality of life argument that I'm going to make has at its heart a policy decision focused on business attraction. So I've spent about the last 25 years writing about the effectiveness of tax incentives. I've published studies on multiple states. I wrote a book on Walmart where we did it again. How did they affect Walmart's location? I have testified in front of 4 legislators in the 4 state legislatures in the U.S. Senate and House on tax incentives that just don't generally generate net income for a region. The ROI is negative. Right, so and this is the reason, because you're chasing these declining jobs. And that's needs to be frankly understood by everybody in the community. I'm not saying don't try to attract businesses. You want businesses to come to your community. But if you're moving resources from attracting these types of jobs to attracting these types of jobs, you ought to anticipate that not working out for you. If you can do low-cost business attraction, that's fine. I think, a better way to do this, and again, this is a new thing. If it were 1960, I would tell you you probably should try to attract those jobs. Manufacturing jobs in the United States peaked, well, here in the Midwest, they peaked about 1972 or 73. They peaked nationally in 1979. Those are the biggest share of attractable jobs. There are new types of attractable jobs that have been created post-COVID, those remote workers who now can go anywhere. We'll talk about that. But those folks are probably not coming because of incentives. They're probably coming because of the same things that attract these folks. They want to be in a place that they like. They want to be in a place that has good schools for their kids and has opportunity and all the other stuff with it. So I'm going to give you a different model of the way the economy works from what you hear when you think about traditional business attraction. And if you watch it was a painful thing to do. If you watch the GOP debate 2 nights ago, they talked about this divergent of policy, right? There's a fundamental disagreement about how to pursue businesses in Indiana going on amongst the GOP. So it's a good, healthy debate that's going on. Right, so economists approach quality of life a little bit differently. We're a heterogeneous species. Some of us like the beach, some of us like mountains. Some of us like to be packed in downtown Manhattan. Other people like to live in a very rural environment in Montana. And so if you make an assumption about what people like, on average, you're probably going to be wrong. Much of the research that tries to decide what it is people like makes an assumption, well, because I like it or because I think people like it, they're moving there and this place has it, I think it could be nice. I think that economists don't like making assumptions about what people like or don't like. We like to see what they do. And there's a couple of good reasons for this. The first one is, everybody who's a Richmond citizen here, I don't need to ask you if you like Richmond. That's a stupid question. You've already voted with your feet, you're here. No need to ask me why I like you, if I like Yorktown or not. I live there. If I thought I could make a better life somewhere else, I would move there. So those of you who are here, you're an important informational conduit, but I would really be interested not just on what you value in the community, but I'm as equally interested in what the other 335 million Americans think about Richmond or Delaware County as well. And so I'm going to look at markets as an economist. Economists, the central thing we look at are market exchange. How do people trade what the process of exchange is driving their decision making. And so what are the types of markets that consumers reveal themselves in that are geographically connected? Well, there's two. One is housing markets, and the other one's labor markets. We buy most of our goods somewhere else. We can buy services somewhere else, but really our labor markets, our local labor markets, and our housing markets are two ways to reveal not just what you all think about the communities that you live in or what I think about the community that I live in, but what those other 335 million Americans think about it as well that aren't here. So you can't survey people to ask that question. You actually have to look at it. You have to look at prices. So the prices in these markets are housing prices and wages. And the way that economists do this is what we would love to do if we could get an experiment. You could do this in East Germany. It's hard to do that in the United States. We would like a natural experiment where we could have all identical homes, and we could plop those identical homes all over the country, and then over the next 20 years, see which places people were willing to pay more to live there in, right? So if everybody had a 3-bedroom brick rancher of 1,200 square feet, if that was the only home available, the prices would still vary. There'd be some places where that home would be very expensive and other places where that home would be very cheap. And then we could just look at the price difference between those homes and say, golly, the places that people are willing to spend $800,000 for that home, they really like that place. Not just the people that are there, but the people who would or somewhere else would like to move there. There's a lot of demand for that place. And the place where that home is $32,000, maybe there's not a lot of demand for that place. People don't like that place. So we don't have an identical home everywhere, but we have enough information about homes, the number of rooms, the year it was built, that we can create a statistically identical home in every county. And then we can measure how much more people are willing to pay for that home in their county than is predicted by creating that statistically identical home or controlling for all of their home characteristics, or how much less they're willing to pay for it. That's the housing. So if they're willing to pay more, that's a good thing. That means you have higher quality of life. If they're willing to pay less than expected, that's low quality of life. And economists have been doing this for about 40 years. And the innovation that we have is we were able to take it down to the county level. Before, we could only do it at the metropolitan area, so that you'd be looking at Wayne County and Fayette County and Park County in the same measurement, which doesn't help an awful lot. So we were able to get down to the county level. So that's half the market. If you're a complete remote worker, maybe that's everything. I just care about the home, and I'm accessing labor markets elsewhere, and remote work's huge now. Maybe 1 in 5 Americans, maybe 2 out of 5 college graduates are effectively fully remote or working 1 day every 2 weeks somewhere, close enough that their commute could be very lengthy. From here to Richmond, from here to Cincinnati, from here to Louisville, from here to Indianapolis, or from here to Fort Wayne, very easily. The other side of this, and by the way, realtors understand this, it's location, 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 right? So that's what we're measuring, is that location effect. And what is it about that neighborhood or that place that's driving the premium that people are willing to pay a house for or lower house prices for? The other flip side of this is labor markets, because if I want to move someplace, I got to get paid. And again, it'd be great if we could create these identical people with the same education and interest and talents and distribute them everywhere and see where they're getting paid. In the places where they're willing to get paid a little bit less to live there, that's a nicer place. People take a little bit cut off a wage premium, maybe if you could live in Palm Beach or in Wyoming. And they take a little bit higher price if it's a crummy place. So when I moved to Muncie, my next door neighbor, I said, how are things going here? And he said, oh yeah, the only problem is I'm on the committee to find new doctors here, and it's horrible. The docs here, we have to pay them more to live in Muncie than we do Carmel. I said, let me tell you about quality of life. Right? And so when we published, and I'll show you some studies of this, some pictures of this in a minute, when we published this on, Brookings Institution published an extract of our research in 2022, and one of the things they said about, they published it for the Midwest, and one of the communities was, I can't remember, it's in Michigan, and it was the highest quality, one of the highest quality of life places in the Midwest, and Richard Florida and somebody else, Traverse City, tweeted out, oh yeah, I just bought a home there, I think it's great. And a colleague of mine in Michigan said, oh, we have a saying here, it's half the pay for a view of the bay in Traverse City. Right, so that's my mantra now, location, 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 housing markets, and half the pay for a view of the bay in Traverse City. And we know this to be true. It's so hard to get doctors into Appalachia. It's so hard to get doctors into remote rural areas because those aren't places that they typically would want to live. So the wage they're getting is so very much higher. And these are just the equations. We have this little equation on housing markets and a little equation on labor markets, and we subtract the value of the housing or the labor market from the housing market, and they're all in log terms. So this is just a percentage of house value and wages that you're willing to either pay more in houses or give up in wages to live in a place. So we can attend a dollar value to that. And it just gives us a pretty good snapshot of what the country looks like, and there's the map of it. The darker brown colors are places that are less fun to live, the bluer are better, right? So there's West Virginia, Huntington, West Virginia, where I worked for a long time, right? Appalachia, West Virginia, Western New York, where there's still 4 feet of snow, right? Those are places that have low quality of life. You know, there's nobody there.
There's nothing down there.
There's nothing there, right? El Paso, Texas, there's an Army division there. Sorry, guys. And so this is a very easy map to defend if you've lived around or traveled around the country. It's a very, very easy map to defend because it tells you that there are places that are distinctly good or bad. This place, I could draw it up, has about national average quality of life. Right? So what that means is that the trade-off in housing and labor markets here is about average, not terribly high or low. The important point here is, though, remember, it's not how cheap your housing is or how expensive your housing is. It's how much more than the value of that home are you willing to pay. So if you, and what's the trade-off with wages? So we get interesting results here that you can get places that are pretty inexpensive and are great places to live, and places that are really expensive and are great places to live, and places that are really expensive but are crummy places to live, and places that are not expensive and are pretty crummy places to live as well. And so it actually turns out that about half of Indiana counties beat San Francisco in quality of life. Right, so nobody drew a better ticket than San Francisco. Right, they got mountains, they got ocean, they got fabulous weather, they have all kinds of cultural assets, the things that you can do there, and yet people are leaving. And we'll come back to why I think that is, because what you hear in cable news is just wrong. All right, it's not about prices, it's not about how expensive it is there, it's about something else, and we'll get back to it. So this is a graphic. This is from our Brookings study. And what it has here is, this is, on the bottom axis here is quality of life in both of these graphics. And the vertical axis here is employment. And I'm sorry, this is population and this is employment. And this is the correlation between population growth between 2010 and 2019 and quality of life. So what our study found is that of the dominant factors involving population change in the United States, quality of life was the strongest factor. I'll show you graphics of that where we decompose all different explanations. There's other reasons why you might move someplace. We think we can measure a lot of them, but this amorphous measurement of quality of life that just assumes people like a place without knowing what about it is they like. And I'll get to what it is about what they like, because that's the other big insight is we can actually, we have data on 600 or 700 different amenities. So in a few minutes, I'll be able to tell you what amenities, what aspects of a local community are most correlated with higher quality of life. Because that's a that's a map to public policy. And so that slope line there, it's hard to see the graphics, I apologize. That's a pretty strong slope, and these are just Midwestern counties. So this is not just a Wyoming or Idaho or California thing or Southeast thing. This is in the Midwest. This is the graphic for employment. The slope here is about twice as steep. So quality of life actually predicts more employment growth than it does population growth in the last decade. And why is that? Well, because the people who are moving work at a much higher rate than the people who are not moving. Right? So if you're interested in attracting jobs, then you probably really ought to be thinking about quality of life. So there's the argument for a public policy that replaces business attraction. You're not trying to attract jobs here, they're coming to you, and I'll show you more on that in a minute. This is a graph of quality of business environment. We use the same tools, I didn't want to talk about it a lot, they use the same tools for measuring quality of business environment, except you add the two because businesses are well known to be willing to pay more for more productive places and people. And it turns out that it's not, these are negative correlations in both population growth and employment growth. The only caveat here is that for first generation immigrants, it's all reversed. They care less about quality of life and more about quality of business environment, primarily because they're mostly coming from places where everywhere in the United States has a better quality of life than where they immigrated from. That's A. And B, and I should say, have neighbors, the three sides that are immigrants, their kids do really well wherever they go to school. They don't care very much about it. If you're an Indian family or a Pakistani family, your kids are going to do well in school the same way Irish Americans' kids did really well in school in 1890 because mom said you didn't have any damn choice, right? My kids didn't do quite as well. They required more kicking than that. And the second factor is that they tend to be more focused on wages, on labor markets. If you're an immigrant to the United States, most immigrants here are coming for economic opportunity, and so there's a much more focus on income than there is that. And most want to go back, and that's been one of the true factors of immigration for over 100 years. So you go back to the 1860s and 1840s or 1860s, most of the Irish, most of the Germans, most of the Poles by the 1890s, most of the Eastern Europeans in the early 1910s, they all planned to go back. About a third did, most stayed, right? So we'll just move on. So there are many different measures in the academic literature about quality of life. Friends of mine at the University of Wisconsin used oversupply of college graduates as a measure because college graduates are the footloose population in the country. Again, they're the ones that move, that leave and come back and forth, move back and forth disproportionately. The probability of inter-county or interstate migration if you hold a bachelor's degree is like 7 or 8 or 9 times that of just a high school degree. It's just an astonishing difference. So the people who are moving are mostly college graduates. And you can predict how many college graduates a place should have by the mix of occupations that they have or the mix of industries that they have and the demographics of the region. So you can predict an oversupply of college graduates or an undersupply of college graduates in every county, and that's what she did. So I did it for the Midwest. This is my estimate for the Midwest, and you can see, and then I said, well, let's just compare the oversupply or undersupply of college graduates, so there's 0, and we'll look at new business growth in that county over the next decade. So this is oversupply in 2010, right? This is a 2010 measure, and this is growth of businesses over the next 11 years. So if you want to build new businesses, it would be great to attract more college graduates or create more college graduates in your community, right? And I'm not doing this on behalf of Ball State. I'm too old for anything that you do to have an effect on Ball State and enrollment there. But for people who are very carefully trying to calibrate schools to supply jobs for local employers, stop. It's not what you need to be doing. You need to be building human capital. If you really want to boost economic performance, just build human capital. Don't try to match labor markets there. It's a mistake. So this is another measure. And normally what Tessa Conroy and Rob Watson did at University of Wisconsin is they used that as a measure of human capital or of quality of life, and they added a bunch of amenities. So this outperformed all the other amenities that they also measured. Amenities like January mean temperature over the past 50 years, or July mean temperature, average humidity in August, or variation in size, the number of miles of lakefront, the number of churches, the percentage of people who in each religion, the Herfindahl index of mix of churches, the number of fast food restaurants. There are about 500 or 600 of these amenities that we have pretty good data on. Now, of course, quality of life isn't the only thing that matters to city growth. If you go back 100 years ago, it probably was not important at all. People didn't have ways of understanding it. There weren't public schools everywhere. Most immigrants came to places that didn't have public schools. We had about a 23 or 24% immigrant share a century ago. We're more like 9 to 12% today. And so it didn't always matter. But there are other factors that can matter, and these are the relative effect of these on business starts per 100,000. So the first of these, and I use two models. The blue is a big model, statistical model. The black's a smaller one. So the first of these are something called agglomerations, or the benefits of being in a city, the productivity benefits. So if you're in a city, generally workers and businesses are more productive. They have better access to talent. There's easier transfer of people to and from businesses. There's more spillovers of knowledge. There's more infrastructure to support businesses in cities. That's what cities have been so dominant over the past 6,000 or 7,000 years, right? That about 4% of the business growth can be explained by that. This is my quality of life measure that we just talked about, 8% and 8.8% in both models. This one is the housing supply elasticity. How quickly can your housing adapt to the number of people that you have? That matters. Having an adaptive supply of housing allows people to move to your city and start new businesses. If you don't build new housing, or if you have rules that prevent the building of new housing, that's going to prevent that. That's about half of quality of life. This is quality of business environment. It's zero. It's negative in this second model. These two are other measures of human capital, right, or quality of life. This is overall housing prices. So just go back through and say people are moving a lot of high-cost places. You'll see that pretty evidently in a couple of graphics. And then this is the share of college graduates. So if you're looking at things that matter to your community, it's the measures of quality of life that matter in generating this. And what are other things that have been traditionally associated with business development or business attraction? Well, there's tax policy. So this is the, I think this is effective property tax rate in Indiana counties and population growth. Right, so people are, when I hear that we need to cut taxes to attract people, I say, you've been to Union County, have you, and which has the lowest tax rate, and you've been to Hamilton County, have you, that has the highest tax rate. And so you might think that people like to go to places that have lower taxes, but they don't. That's not the way this works. And the reason for this is that people aren't stupid. Right? So when I go to buy a car, I don't go walk in and say, could you show me the lowest price car on the lot? Right? Because that's the damn car I'm going to drive out of here today. I look around for value. I'm looking for value. I'm willing to pay more for a better car. I'm looking for value. I'm a human being. I'm not an infant. Right? So the idea that it's taxes are driving is just, not only is it empirically incorrect, right? And this, by the way, holds everywhere. And this is income tax and this is property tax. It's infantilizing to adults, right? That we're so stupid that we're just going to go to the place that has the lowest taxes. But and so in every other domain of our life, we think about value. We think, well, how good are the schools? How safe is the neighborhood? Right? When in other domains of our life, I'm looking at the car, I'm saying, you know, does it have the safety features like? Is it cool? Right? Is enough room for my kids to be distant in the back of it so I don't have to hear them? All right? There are things about cars that I'm smart enough as a sentient adult to make decisions on. If I'm going to buy new shoes or clothes or I'm going to go get lunch, I'm thinking about value, not price. And so in public policy domain, when you're talking about tax rates, you've got to talk about value, not price. People are willing to pay more to have better stuff, better, and by that I mean better locally provided public services. If the tax rate is too high so that the value starts going down, if your local government is doing a bad job, think San Francisco, right? Think Portland. Places that people 20 years ago were flocking to because it was great, and then they decided, well, we don't need, it would be inconvenient to tell people not to defecate on the sidewalk. Those places are now in a process of losing population because of it. All right, so the idea that taxes alone are driving it's terrible. It's really the value proposition. So here they're moving more with higher effective tax rate and property taxes and income taxes. And these are median house prices in Indiana, right? So people are moving to the high cost places. Again, they're looking for value. They're looking for value. So when it's important, I think, in having debates about public policy to think very hard about this value proposition. Do tax incentives work, right? So this is business startups per 100 residents and the over and under supply of education in Indiana, right? Highly educated places are adding people hand over fist. Poorly educated places are losing. That's zero, right? So all these places are losing and all these places are gaining. And this is tax incentives as exemptions as a share of total assessed value. All right, so this is how that population effect works in attracting businesses. This is in people. This is a tax-adjusted quality of life. It's where I look at the quality of life and I control for the local total effective tax rate, state and local effective tax rate. And you can see that the higher quality of life here, when you control for property taxes, is very strongly correlated with population growth. And these are all those high tax counties. And these are all the low tax counties. This is Martin County. All right, these are low, very low tax counties, and these are high tax counties. I hate taxes. I'm an economist that grew up to adulthood in the 1980s, right? I'm a Reagan Republican. I hate taxes. But, you know, people don't. People don't. They don't have a real problem with them. My wife doesn't. She's like, why are you worried about taxes? This is a great school district. You're talking paying $500 more a year to get a great school. So you know, that conversation's being had everywhere around the country. And this is GDP, so it's not just jobs, it's not just businesses, it's not just people, it's also the economy. Economic activity is being driven by quality of life. Over and over again, that's what we find. The studies of these, and there's several dozen of these type of long technical studies that we've produced and other people have produced, say the same thing over and over again. One study is never a breakthrough study. Certainly mine aren't. But when you start seeing 40, 50, 60 peer-reviewed academic studies in journals that are saying the same thing over and over again. We've had some innovation in our studies. We can go back to 1980. Quality of life wasn't as important in 1980 as it is now. It's a lot more important now. We can tell more things about our community. So there are studies that are especially insightful, but it is a repetitive story. There's an equal or much larger number of studies on tax incentives and business business attraction that say exactly the same thing. They don't work. Or if they have an effect, it's tiny, it's trivial, or and certainly not worth the expenditures. So what amenities matter? So what we did, we used artificial intelligence, and we said we've got quality of life in 3,082 counties out of the 3,143 county-sized units in the U.S. And we have about 600 different amenities. And they measure everything, the number of fitness centers, the number of public fitness centers, the number of private fitness centers. I've just given you this enormous listing of amenities. And we said which one of these in combination, and this is the algorithm we wrote, in combination have the best statistical fit with quality of life. And you can share this with the audience down the road. And we put them into 3 buckets. Natural amenities, right? These are things that either God or the federal government put in your community. Some people confuse the two, right? These are public amenities. These are things that the state or more often the local government controls. These are private amenities. The economic term in the literature is endogenous amenities. These things follow people. These things are produced by local government, and these things are going to be there whether you're there or not, for the most part. And so I've labeled them plus or minus. So coastlines are plus, medium January temperatures. The warmer it is in January, the better it is. The parks per square mile. Hilliness is negative. Arable land is negative. People don't move to big farming areas. Medium July temperatures, if it's cooler in July, they like it more. And forest coverage is negative. Turns out people don't like being in counties that have, like Harrison County that has the Hoosier National Forest. Not a big quality of life. That's important because quality of life often devolves to, oh, we've got nice restaurants or we have a big state park. That's not what people value. They value a big mix of these. Now, you can't do a lot for these. What you can do is provide something that enhances them. You can make access better. You can work on environmental quality. You can provide services in those parks that people care about that are substitutable. So it doesn't mean that government can't, I often hear, oh, we can't rely. I've heard this from state elected officials, over and over. We don't have high quality of life in Indiana because we don't have mountains. And so we got to worry about something else. And the argument, that's just so, the technical term for it is idiotic. Right? Because what it would mean is that, okay, you can't build mountains here, but you can do things to improve the quality of the natural resources that you do have. And I think Indiana does a pretty decent job with that. We have great state parks and other things, but we don't have really good environmental quality. Right? We're a pretty dirty place. And then let's skip over to private amenities, an area that I also think Indiana does pretty well in. Right? These are private sector things: home furnishing stores, fitness places, food stores, personal care services, eating and drinking places. This is the HHI of religious membership, right? So it's the concentration. We kind of like places that have a fewer, bigger churches, right? Are you a micropolitan area? That's a plus. Right? That's where we are, that we just threw that into that. Recreational locations, positive. Total share of religious activities, positive. Negative are urgent care facilities, arts and culture places, and golf courses. Now we think, wait a minute, I like arts and culture places. I left that in there because we're going through, it turns out that if you can, we haven't published it yet, but if you control for the year that the place was founded, a lot of these things effects go away. The reason is there's a ton of arts and culture places in like Boston because it was settled in 1642, and there are not nearly as many in say Kansas because it was a state in what 1859, 1860, and so the places that were founded earlier have more arts and culture recreational areas. So we're trying to work on measurements of these, and we're working to do some web scraping to look at number of visits to these areas or how cool are they, not just are they a roadside attraction. I grew up in Virginia on land that was owned by George Washington, me and 3.7 million other people, right? And so if you had gone to my little community, there were literally every street had a historic marker sign on it because stuff had been going on historically there for 400 years, not so much other places. Yes?
What's wrong with urgent care facilities?
All right, because they tend to move to places that are poorer, right? So now, so what do you say is, so it could be that places really need an urgent care facility, right? Or golf courses are consistently negative for some odd reason. I don't play golf, so I don't see anything particularly good or bad about them, but it puzzles me. I think it's generally because they're moving to places that are less expensive, right? So but what's the point here? What's the public policy response? Very little to decide what people should like. Government's not in the business of deciding what types of restaurants or bars or urgent care facilities will come to a community. They're in the business of allowing demand to be met by new businesses. So Indiana, you can start a new business in a few hours. If two of us wanted to start a business today, we could go get online within an hour or so, we could start a business. It takes 6 months in California. Survey results of migrants from California to Texas, Americans who've moved, not immigrants, but migrants from California to Texas, one of the top 5 things they cite is the ability to start a new business. Right, so if you wanted to start a food truck in California for this summer, it's too late. You're not going to get the permits to do so. You want to have a permit this weekend in Muncie for a food truck, you could have one. So we do pretty good in this area, right? It doesn't mean we don't, you wouldn't like to see more coming, but that's not the things for government there is just to get out of the way of the private sector. This is where government has a role, and what matters here, school spending as a share of GDP. And I didn't put it on this graphic, but there's numbers associated with that. That number is bigger than all the other effects combined. That's the number one factor. And why do we think school spending? Does that make a lot of sense? It's probably a proxy measure for school quality. It's a pretty loose measure of school quality, but public spending on schools matters. If we substitute like 8th grade math scores, it does well. There's just not an easy measure at the county level of school quality. You would think we would have great measures of it. We just don't. Commuting times are positive. Share working from home. That appeared only after about 2010 because the share of people working from home was very low before that. Relative income mobility, this is from a study at Harvard for every county. Years of potential life loss, this is from the CDC. So less healthy places are less attractive. All right, so that's one of the more consistent results. The places where people die earlier, that's years of potential life loss, is how many years of life per capita are lost on average from the median lifespan in the US. Right, so if you have people dying at 75 on average men and the lifespan's 76, and you got 10,000 men, you're losing 10,000 years of life with that. So that's consistently negative. Road miles is negative for some odd reason. Distance to a metro area is negative. Physically unhealthy days, and this is income inequality. Those are different measures. We actually have several hundred of these that rank, but these are rank order by size in each one of those, right? So coastline is more important than January temperature. School spending more important than other things. And by the way, crime rate usually pops in there as well. And then basically, I think this suggests places where businesses can start rather than individual businesses. School performance is the most important measure, right? So it's always important to talk to who's your audiences with this. These are, this is from Indiana's ranking system that we did away with in 2019 because it made so many people angry. We had A through F schools, and these are percentage population enrollment changes, and by percent, these are the A schools. These were 9% of schools. They had all the enrollment growth. These are B's, C's, D's, and F schools, and these are numbers, these are percentages. That's why schools matter most, right? If you have A school corporations, and these are measures of normally based on a variety of factors, you're going to see growth. There's the zero line. Everybody else was negative. Local schools are both a supply side effect and demand side effect for quality of life, so it's an important piece. Couple other things that are specific to this community. We worry about housing. Housing is a symptom of quality of life, long-term quality of life, and what's happened in a community. Right, so what we have here, just to give you background, it's completely accepted in economics at this point, housing economics, that if you live in a place where population is growing, you should have nearly constant building of new homes. But that should be an expansion of new homes. So it's almost a perfectly elastic housing market. So every new home, every new household is going to absorb a new home. But housing is a durable good. The majority of homes built in the United States since 1607, the founding of Jamestown, are still standing. Almost all the homes built in Richmond are still here. Doesn't matter what year they were built. And if you're in a declining community, building comes to almost a complete stop. So this was a pretty important study from the late 2000s, 2006, 2007. We added this to dynamically. So we looked over time, and we have 3 different series here. This is the Federal Housing Finance Authority median home price in a county. It's on an index, right? This is Wayne County. Then we have the cost of new home construction. This is on an index, right? And it indexed the same year. We had pretty good housing starts in 2000 nationwide. It was profitable to build a home. Home building profits have to range between about 10 and about 18% for builders to build new homes. And so this was a profitable area. This is new housing starts in the county. You can see when it was profitable to build a home, there was a lot of housing starts. Like much of Indiana, it no longer became profitable to build new homes between 2006 and 2007. That was the housing bust. And it has not been profitable since then to build a new home. It's not now. And the reason for that, there's about a 13% vacancy rate of new housing here, according to the census, which is pretty high. And y'all are thinking, well, gosh, that's because these are places people don't want to live. I don't dispute that, but they're habitable homes. If they were in Chicago, they would be worth $750,000. Right, so that's your fundamental problem. Now, there are certainly, for those of you thinking about housing issues, segments of markets that you may need, right? This is a symptom of some quality of life deficit. There's a symptom here that's a problem. Doesn't mean you don't treat the symptom, but don't think this is the cause of a problem, right? If you have a cold, you treat the runny nose and the fever, but that's not the cause of the problem. So if you work on quality of life, you'll you'll focus on that. And I told you y'all have about average quality of life. Keep in mind that the real population growth is happening in the top third or fewer counties of quality of life. It's really happening in better places. There are about 1,000 counties, about a third of counties in the United States that are rural, almost 100% are losing, or non-metro areas are losing people. This is cumulative of population. I don't want to show you this. I'm going to back up. The United States has not created a net new job for 30 years for anybody who's not been to college. Let me say that again. There's been negative net job growth for high school graduates and those without a high school degree since 1992. That's the first year we had that data in the current population survey. Probably been true since about 1975. So there's no net job growth nationally for people who haven't been to college. 81% of that job growth went to people who have a bachelor's degree or higher, 19% to associate's degree or some college exposure, job losses for high school graduates and those with less than a high school degree. That's just the way the U.S. has been. And that's true at any time you slice that data over any business cycle. Right, so it's true from 2010 onward. It's nearly true. It's a little bit, there have been more job creation for less well-educated people since the pandemic. It's still disproportionately 60-70% college graduate. So when you're thinking about education policy, when you hear, oh, there's plenty of jobs for the trades, so there's plenty of jobs for people who have educational attainment that's not college, let's see if that's true or not. This is the same data, shorter time period. This is quarterly data in Wayne County. The yellow are college graduates. There's 359 more. These are adults, age 25 and older. We don't have a good measure of educational attainment for the 18 to 24-year-old crowd because they're still in school. And so for adults, if you're a college graduate, there have been 359 more jobs over the past 20 years. Most all of them in net since the end of the pandemic. If you're a less than high school graduate, there's a loss of 250 jobs. If you have some college, 2 years, associate degree or some college, 700 fewer jobs. And if you're a high school graduate, only 3,200 fewer jobs. Right. When I emphasize the importance of college education in my columns, and I talk about that, it's because this is true nationally in most everywhere. There's still jobs available in replacement jobs, but it absolutely makes me feel nauseous when I hear there's plenty of good jobs available and we're telling middle school kids that you could go to the trades, there's plenty of opportunities for you in the trades. That's just not true. And the people telling that to students, if they're elected officials or business owners, never would choose that for their kids. So when you hear that, we should emphasize the trades or we don't need to push people into college, ask that person what their children are doing. Because the person who's been loudest about that in the state, the two people that have been loudest about that over the past 10 years, one of them, all of their children have a PhD, and the other one, their kids went to Harvard and Yale. So maybe they're not looking out for the best interest of your kids, right? This is a pretty consistent story that job creation's better for the very high end and the very low end, right? That's that bifurcation of jobs. So there are definitely middle-class jobs that have been a problem. The bigger problem here is how many of these folks moved away that have gone somewhere else and got education and moved somewhere else as well. That's a real challenge. And just let me be clear, there are replacement jobs in those areas, but if you're in a county, you don't care about replacement jobs very much. I know it's probably really hard to get a plumber. It's really hard to get a plumber in Muncie. But if you want your community to grow and you're sending kids to fill replacement jobs, your community is not going to grow. The only way it's going to grow is with this. So what are the big points? We're all victims of when we grew up. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, so I think about a time when a third of adult men, a third of all workers were factory workers. If it was in this county, it's probably 45%. Delaware County, over 60% were factory workers. If you wanted to work, you had to go to the place that that job was, and there weren't a lot of other types of jobs, far fewer other types of jobs available around the country. So people moved to places where there were jobs. Today, it's about 8% of people work in manufacturing. More than half have been to college. It's very intensive in rural places, and the other available careers are everywhere. So between 1962 when I was born, when I graduated college in 1984, I'm going to my 40th year reunion this weekend, right? My classmates picked businesses that they wanted to go work for Boeing, or they wanted to go work for a large manufacturing firm. As a military school, so most of us were going off to the service. We were picking an organization to go to. I just took my graduate students and undergraduate students to lunch this week that are graduating. This summer is hell for a professor who needs students working for him because they're all gone. And this is their last week. So we took them to lunch out, and all of them, I knew this, we asked all of them, they're not looking for a job in a business. They're not targeting a particular business, they're targeting a place. It's Indianapolis, it's Charlotte, it's Austin, it's Chicago. They're not choosing businesses, they're choosing place. Right? So this quality of life piece has emerged as the dominant force. It's beating out the size of cities, it's beating out wage premium, it's quality of life. We measure it, right, based on some unexplained extra value people place on a place because of its housing markets and labor markets. That varies for everyone, but we're looking at big averages, and in that way we're able to judge not just what people who live here think about the community, but what people who might potentially live here or choose not to live here also think about that. Our measures of quality of life outperform all the other measures of business attraction, tax abatements, tax rate differences, low cost of housing, all that stuff. So if you're just doing a race of places that are following business attraction policies and those that are following quality of life, over and over quality of life is outperforming them. The biggest one is public schools or schools overall. The number of private schools actually matters as well. So I'm sorry if y'all don't like school choice, it actually matters, right? It's an important characteristic of school choice. Our early, and I didn't show it here, post-COVID measures show that the effective quality of life on migration and population growth is of between 4 and 6 times as large as it was in the last decade. That is consistent with the observation in our monthly or bi-monthly household pulse surveys from the census that show a shocking amount of remote work. Here in Indiana, there are over 1 million people out of 3.5 million workers who report that they worked remotely at least one day last week. 1 out of 3. It's about 15% or 16% that are effectively fully remote. In other words, over the past week and a half, they haven't been to a work site. They're working from home. Just to put that in context, there's about 535,000 factory workers, so about twice as many remote workers in Indiana as there are manufacturing workers. The pursuit of this quality of life is long and costly. That's one of the reasons why I think communities find it so difficult to make the long-term investment. If you want to change the school outcomes for your students, there's almost nothing you can do for anybody who's in school right now, right? Any school teachers here? All right, come from a family with a lot of people education degrees. The mantra is you know which kids are going to graduate and go to college in 3rd grade. And they're largely right. Right? You kind of know which kids are going to be successful in 3rd grade. So by 3rd grade, whatever the school contribution or whatever the public contribution to that kid's education is not written in stone but heavily determined. You can have a really rigorous high school to improve that. You can have more AP choices and offerings. You can push children harder in middle school and high school. That's what successful students, or schools do. But if you really want to have an effect, it's going to be in the early childhood education arena, which means that's a 20 to 25 year effect. If you're going to improve your downtown, if you're going to do things to make downtown nice and really vibrant, to make it look like a Madison, for example, that's going to take 40 or 50 years. And if you go to Madison today, they've been working on it for 40 or 50 years, right? Just because something is long and difficult doesn't make it something you don't do. It just makes it less likely to attract civic attention when people think all of our problems are urgent. The other thing I'll say is quality of life spending or higher taxes doesn't seem to be having an ill effect on population growth. And again, I'm not pushing higher taxes. I'm pushing for honestly assessing value and treating citizens as if they're value shoppers. They're not infants. I know we don't do that in most civic, very few, I talk to the Mayor's Institute all the time. Mayors try to really emphasize that. It's what they really focus on doing. But there are an awful lot of people running for office who don't do that. There's an awful lot of people who are saying, I just need lower taxes, instead of thinking through whether or not people are smart enough to judge the value of the place they live. And the evidence is people aren't stupid. And quality of life is a real, I argue that the things that you would do to focus on quality of life will solve a lot of your other problems in the long run. They'll solve your poverty problems. They'll solve your problems in schools. They'll solve some of your problems in housing. They'll solve some of your problems in business and labor market opportunities for other folks. So if you really focus on making a place that people want to live, the resulting other fixes are more likely to, the other things are going to likely be fixed. And it doesn't mean you don't treat them, again, doesn't mean you don't directly treat poverty, but if that's all you do is directly treat poverty and try to make short-term fixes to it, it will never go away. If all you're trying to do is to add new housing, you're not thinking about other aspects of this, you're always going to have a housing problem. So that's my argument. And you can find a lot of our quality of life and tax research on our university website at CBER. And I write about these things on a Substack, which you can subscribe to if you want. Whenever I write something new, you get an email. It's free. And now I think I have time for questions. Yes, sir.
I get your argument on quality of life, but the timeline on it is impressive. It's almost like asking me, am I going to be able to run a 4-minute mile? I mean, you're looking at generations to make these kind of changes. And human beings, we like to see things in a few years. I see why we would lean into an industrial park or something, because we can do that, we can manufacture that. This quality of life issue, yeah, you're talking decades.
Right, but I have a lot of hope. So I think when you're thinking about where you relocate with children, so I moved 4 times with small kids, I wasn't so much concerned about how good the schools were. I didn't even care about how good the high school was today for the most part, right, till the last move when they were in middle school. I really cared about where the direction of the community was going. So I think you can see results moving pretty quickly, or within a decade certainly. And in the places that have slipped, like Portland, I just tell you, I'm Secretary Treasurer of an organization that does conferences for academic conferences, and I was at one in Portland in I was there in 2003, I think, or 2002. Great place. Downtown Portland was fantastic. Everybody wanted to go there. It was a hot new market. By the time I went there in 2012, boy, they were having some homeless problems. They weren't enforcing code. People were sleeping in other folks' backyards or every civic space. And now they haven't had an academic conference in like 8 years. It's just collapsed. So the effect in both directions is faster than you think. But Madison, you could tell when I first visited Madison, Indiana, my wife's from that area in the early 1990s. I said, gosh, this place has a lot of potential. They said, oh, you should see how much better it was than 30 years ago. And you go 30 years from now, it's just like an oasis. So you can definitely see decade by decade change. And so it just requires having that longer term. And again, I don't say don't try to attract businesses, but if that's your primary focus and you're moving resources from that, away from schools, away from public safety, away from or eliminating blight and all those other things, that's a problem. If you're building new housing, that's great if you can manage to do that. I know that's a difficult thing to do. If you're not also eliminating blight as fast or faster, then you're never going to solve your housing supply problem. So it has to go both ways. And there are no easy answers. Yes, ma'am.
I'm reading a book called On the Move, and it's about climate change within the U.S. And they're saying that climate change disasters or the raising temperatures is causing already migrations of populations from the coasts. And they talked about if there's a major disaster, we're going to have climate change refugees that could be within the U.S. and U.S. citizens that are climate change refugees. Is there some way that a community or a county or city can foresee and predict this if all of a sudden
there are now academic studies that are suggesting there's a negative premium on housing directly adjacent to coastal areas, sea areas. So that means that yes, that's happened. So I'm an economist, and so I've now watched, when I started graduate school in 1993, I heard about climate change. So now, I'm 30+ years into this imminent problem. And the first evidence that it's actually changing behaviors in human beings has been in the last 5 to 7 years. That housing values are dropping on the coast because of proximity. I'm just dubious that you're going to see really big shocks to that area, but we've had very, I was involved in Hurricane Katrina the week after it happened, wrote most of the interagency performance technical evaluation for that. That was the closest we've come to it. It's had almost no shock outside the local area. So, I wouldn't, yeah, yes. Right, so that, there was some movement from there to Houston. When they moved people, there was housing available in Houston, so it expanded. That was where most of them relocated to because of facilities. But there's not like a diaspora from New Orleans, and people are now living in places that are still at risk. And so I'm dubious that that's certainly not an intermediate term strategy. Might it be an end of century strategy? Probably. The reason I argue that is that there are an awful lot of ways people defeat sea rise. And just if you've ever spent any time in the Netherlands, you can tell that. So I'm suspicious of the doomsday. We're pretty adaptive in those areas. So I think cities could move west if you're on the East Coast, or west in the east if you're on the west, or east if you're in the West Coast. I think you could see human migration, but it's not going to be like people moving to Buffalo to avoid rising water in Myrtle Beach.
Well, I'm thinking also earthquakes. I mean, we've got a Earth's mantle that's shifting.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
That's possibilities increasing.
Yeah. I wouldn't build an economic development strategy around it. But if you have good, and people will move for a high quality of life if that's the case. Yes, sir.
There are a lot of people in this room, I think, who are interested in historic preservation. So I'd be curious what your observations are, the correlation between quality of life and cities and towns that have made a commitment to preserving their historic resources.
Right, so I haven't written any studies on it, but I think the academic literature points towards historic preservation is a big role. And certainly in the places that are really leading with that sort of stuff are like Savannah and Annapolis and Madison, that have done a really good job in historic preservation. And I think so when you're thinking about housing policy, or if you're thinking about blight removal, that one of the places where it's easiest or least expensive to make improvements is to go back and retrofit historic places that have historic significance. People value these things, and so can you have high quality of life if you've had no historic preservation? If you're a really new place, yeah, perhaps. But the places that seem to really bubble up in the quality of life metrics have played a lot of attention on that domain.
It has to do with public policy within the cities, places that have ordinances and historic districts that are actually protected. That's why I wanted to.
Right. So no, I haven't done those studies, but I've seen a couple that suggest, yeah, they're benefiting as long as they're not really driving. I mean, they can be overdone in driving people away. There's no evidence that that's the case anywhere in Indiana, that we have historic preservation rules that are preventing housing supply. So that could have been a problem in DC in the 1970s. It could have been a problem in San Francisco today. It's not a problem in Indiana. So I think that would be a very useful strategy, particularly in a place that has downtowns that people find attractive and interesting, but maybe need support. And I would put Richmond in that. There are many parts of this city that are attractive that you could see more investment in that. It's just part of the puzzle, Marsh. And we've talked about it before. The argument for quality of life is that you approach this from about 1 million different angles, not just one. Yes, ma'am.
I'm here today with a group that has looked into the Gallup Healthways poll regarding quality of life and well-being. And one of the observations I think that it's made is about housing and neighborhoods being to make that social connection. And I'm curious about, in your list and in your studies, how do you see social media and in particular the replacement of close connections and how our relationships contribute to our well-being.
Great. Right. So the question was, was about the effect of social media and quality of life. So what we're measuring is relative quality of life. And when you look at the social media research that has said social media the early research, some of it good, some of it very preliminary, has suggested social media causes some potential problems. There's some benefits in terms of being connected to people, but some potential problems with isolation. Our studies look at relative quality of life, and since it's everywhere, it's not that great. And so the studies that I think have done better at sort of measuring this, and they're trying to answer the geographic questions, find places where there's a lot of social media connections locally, do better. Right, so like if you have an active Facebook page that is local, if you want to email me, I could point you to a couple of those studies. There's a huge health literature on quality of life that's health and social well-being oriented. And so that's different than the economics. That's very much, so if you go to a medical journal or a health services research, they'll study quality of life. It's different a little bit of what we're doing because it's so survey-based. And economists don't trust surveys. We don't care what you say, we care what you do. So that's we're low on the emotional index. We don't care what people say, just what they do. Yes, sir. Just come over.
A couple things. One of us, we sat near the back and really couldn't see the slides well. Can you share that presentation?
Yes, if organizers are happy to do that. If you want to contact me, I'll email it to you. But happy to share it however works for you all.
And then my actual question was, how do you tease apart the causality? Because it seems like poor health outcomes, negative quality of life, but it could be those people can't move. You're tied to your doctors and you just,
We actually think these are that we infer no causal inference there. They're actually called endogenous, which is a fancy way of saying the causation goes both ways. right? So that in the private amenity piece, we don't think that's causing quality of life. We think it's responding to human migration, right? In these two, we think there's very strong causal inference with a couple of exceptions, right? So it doesn't mean in places that do poor on quality of life, they don't have any of these things. They have a lot fewer of these because it's harder to start a business there. So we don't think that the difficulty of starting a business is not a causal inference, a causal effect on quality of life. We think but knowing exactly what businesses go there, we're not sure. So that's what we tell people. Don't, in your policies, right, if you can't determine causation or at least have pretty good confidence on causation, don't do anything. So when you have these that, you know, we would encourage not somebody to say, oh gosh, we don't have enough furniture stores in Richmond to go out and try to recruit a furniture store. It's really that's following it. For these, we think they're pretty strong causally. They're strong causally in theory. So I didn't talk a lot about it, but the original research that was published in 1979 and then in 1982 was built on basic human behavior. What do people's preferences and how do they trade off preferences? And so the work was designed to measure those trade-offs. And so in our papers, we have that approach, and if these are predictions, the predictions of quality of life are on population employment. So if you had negative effect on, if people were fleeing high quality of life places, that would reject your theory. If your theory is that you would see migration of population growth in higher quality of life places, that would fail to reject that theory. And so we've been through hundreds of studies in metro area, dozens on micro and rural places that fail to reject that theory. So that's our determination of causation. So it's typical science. We have a hypothesis, we test the hypothesis, we either reject it or fail to reject it. And that a lot of people think science proves things. We don't. We just disprove things. And then if we fail to disprove it over and over and over, we start accepting it.
There's been considerable controversy about housing policy recently in Richmond. The city has commissioned a number of housing studies that have indicated a dramatic need for more housing. Including market rate housing. And the people, your graph showed that it may not be economically feasible to build a lot of those houses. One answer that has been given recently is if you build complexes with greater population density, it's more economical. And therefore, that's what we ought to be doing. But that's proved to be pretty unpopular in Richmond. What's your general advice to us about strategy?
Right, so it's completely plausible. So you have 3,000 excess homes here in the county that are habitable according to the census in 2020. So if you've got a roof punctured or plywood on your window, they don't count the home. And part of that's a model, but they do pretty good survey, and that's pretty consistent with other of a place this size. Muncie's got about 5,000, a little bit bigger population, about 5,000. So it's entirely plausible that there are whole segments of markets for housing in your community that are just missing, that people can't find a home that they would like in that category in that area. So that's entirely, I haven't read the studies, but I find it very plausible. So the challenge is, can you meet that demand without subsidizing it, right? Because if most of that new housing is being subsidized, and I'm not against subsidized housing, but are you doing it in a way where the existing homeowners are paying for it? Because that's when you subsidize what happens. And is that enhancing their property values in the long run, or is it reducing them because of an excess supply? So my argument here isn't about, I haven't read your study, so I can't comment on it intelligently, but as part of that, how do you eliminate the excess blight? Is it through infill? Is it through, or do you have a more extreme version like Youngstown, Ohio, or Detroit, where you have whole neighborhoods that are no longer they're no longer viable, and they're just not going to be viable? Most Midwestern cities have city block after city block after city block that will never be fully occupied again. And so do you wait for 100 years to finally decide that and let nature demolish them, or do you do it along the way? Those are the types of trade-offs that I think you have to make. In terms of giving a micro-analysis, I'd have to read the studies and do my own and all that, so I can't be too smart with that. Let me go way back here. Yes.
So as you're aware of, a lot of Midwestern cities, and especially in Indiana, we are declining in population. So Richmond has gone from 50,000 in 1970 to 36,000 today. We have, when we talk about quality of place, quality of life, we have tools in our toolbox that we, as a community, as a county, that we're not currently using. One in particular would be a food and beverage tax. That tax, which is a choice tax that visitors pay, as well as locals, could be used for a variety of projects that could enhance our quality of place, such as downtown revitalization, such as investment in our Star District and building those homes, such as the Whitewater Gorge Activation Plan, and numerous other ones. Richmond was just acknowledged as a micropolitan community, and obviously that's, in my mind, dealing with, I guess, 6 or 7 projects that they've noted are in development. And a large part of that is because of ARPA help, Earl and Lilly grant, et cetera, that is really happening right now, which is giving us that synergy to do these things. How important is it for a community to use as many tools in their toolbox to help move these things forward at a faster pace?
So the tax economist in me says tax everything at a low rate, right? So, and one of the things about a food and beverage tax is you're exporting it. You're causing visitors to pay for things. And so it's tends to be a fairly attractive tax. I mean, your residents are as well, but it's primarily your visitors that are doing so. So I would argue that that would be a good thing to have a very frank debate about. What are the trade-offs with that sort of activity, instead of just working on one single tax instrument, because it's good to have visitors pay for it. So the places that have food and beverage taxes tend to have a lot of visitors, and so that people understand that you're doing that. But you have a lot of people coming here to visit Earlham and to do other things, so it's not inconceivable that that could be the case. In terms of individual projects, I don't know, y'all are far better informed about those than I would be.
When, just for a point of reference, when we looked at doing a food and beverage tax, or at least contemplating it, we've had a legislation in place since 2005, and we've never acted upon that yet. But in 2018, when we were looking at that again, it was through various means of using the NAICS codes, it would have been deemed to generate about $1.5 to $2 million a year. Mm-hmm. And so it's not a huge amount to get a lot of huge projects done, but over years incrementally, it can very much add up to allow us, because of our eroding tax base, to do some things that we as a community right now can't do because our tax base is eroding.
Right, and so my advice would be is not raise taxes, but don't be afraid if you think the value of that. Higher taxes are not driving people away from communities. Not in Indiana, it's bad public services, inadequate public services. And so don't be afraid of don't think that's going to drive people or economic activity away if the value of what you're providing is higher than the services. And that's a political argument, right? We try to measure in economics, but in terms of getting the tax passed, it's a political argument. Yes, ma'am. Does somebody else have? I think time. Yes.
Yeah, with the housing, as you described, oversupply of housing, but a large part of the problem are ill-fitting houses for the populations that are increasing. For example, there are fewer smaller families. The 3-bedroom, 2-bath house it might be too big or not appropriate. So with smaller housing, they can be lesser costs, but it also involves zoning and then changing some zoning laws so you can put more houses there.
Right, and I'm going to be, I'm not going to lend my weight to either side of this. Just be respectful of the conversation that, there are probably segments of housing that are missing that people could move here for. You could also make a mistake and think there's a segment that just shifts people from existing homes that are substandard into this other place. And so whoever owned that substandard home, right, or less attractive home has now been damaged. And so that's one of the problems with using tax dollars for this sort of activity to subsidize it, is that you're essentially saying you got a homeowner or renter and the home is worth almost nothing, somebody's living in it, but they're still that person's paying taxes on it. If you subsidize new housing, you're asking that person who's paying taxes to have somebody else rent in another place. So housing units that are primarily rental like that, may fit a segment of the market, but they're not costless. And none of these things are costless enterprises.
Right, but in some places where they're just doing small house communities or small house subdivisions, seniors move in, that they can do more higher density, I guess is what I'm trying to say, within city limits. And that can be part of a.
Right, no, absolutely it can be part of it, but it's never costless.
What are your feelings on a land-based tax as opposed to current tax structure? Land value.
Right,
Land-based.
so land-based, that's called a Georgia's tax. There you just tax land. There's a good economic argument that land itself, the value of land captures all the activity that occurs on it into the value of that land. So if you just taxed the value of the land, you would be taxing everything that's happening there, and that would capture the consumption, the income, and the wealth that occurs on that land. That sounds really good in implementation. It's really hard in the sense that valuing the land is really, really difficult. In fact, the first national land value study ever done at the county level was released in the last 90 days. And the correlation between land value and home value is extraordinarily high, like a 0.9, 0.96. So 90% of the variation in land or home prices explain the other. So what most economists say, because there's competing benefits of taxes, is tax everything at a low rate. So if you tax everything that happens at the lowest possible rate, you're not picking and choosing distortions. And so that's, when you get rid of a single tax, what you do is you're now meriting that activity that was taxed at the expense of the other activities that are going to now be taxed at a higher rate.
Very good. Well, that's enough. Oh, go ahead, Paul.
I know your figures were 2020 that showed available housing of 3,000. Today, in the countywide multiple list, there's 70 listings available, or 70 homes available. Recent housing study that was finished in December of last year showed the need of 2,500 single-family homes that were needed in the county. So I guess my question is, what was the 3,000 made up of in 2020?
I don't know, but multi-listing services for terms of measuring homes is trash data.
And it said that there were 3,000 listings available in 2020?
No, they're not listings, they're vacant homes that somebody owns. So I had the same thing in Muncie's got 80 homes, and yet you go to the Muncie Star Press and you open up and there's 13 pages of unsold.
So they could be vacant homes that
They're all vacant homes.
that are not habitable.
No, they're habitable, just nobody wants to, no realtor's gonna take it on because it's a lot of work and you're not gonna, I know your basic is like $1,000 for a realtor. These are homes that are, if you were to pick those homes up and move them to Chicago, they'd be worth $750,000. But they're so
I don't know where these homes are. I mean,
Well, we could probably find some walking around
Some
here.
across the street.
And trust me, the census get people, I have this argument with realtors all the time. The multi-listing service are the homes that people are willing to pay a realtor to sell, and a realtor is willing to take on at that price. So there
Or that people want to live in.
No, it's all price oriented in the MLS. Has nothing to do with if people want to live in it. It's, are you willing to take it on as a realtor? And is somebody willing to have you take it on? And you go to the sheriff's sale in here and they have thousands, I guarantee you, thousands of homes a year that don't sell because nobody wants them. There's no demand for them.
That's right.
Right. But if you, the demand is driven not by the fact that they're crummy homes, right, or there's something wrong with them, they're in the wrong place. They're here in Richmond and not in Carmel. All right, that's the point of this, is that what you see driving the effect here is just low demand. And that's why when a bank, are there any bankers here? Right, bankers, and I'll just say this really quickly and then close up, but when a bank does a assessment of whether or not they're going to loan money to a realtor, to a developer, the first thing they do is hire a consultant who goes to the census data and says, what are the available housing supply here and property, and they build a model of demand, and they're going to X out almost all of East Central Indiana because of the excess supply of homes here. And so this isn't a housing economist or a housing finance consultant, probably a professor part-time at NYU, and that's what they're doing. And so it doesn't matter what the MLS says. They don't care about that. What they care about is how much housing supply it is, and they're not going to rent. They're not going to give mortgages. They're typically, when you talk about comparables, it's because there's so much difficulty in building a home or getting a comparable to build a home. That's because the market's working. That's banks saying, I'm not going to lend you money to build the home because, as I illustrated here, the cost of building that home is higher than the value of that home. And so does anybody think that the home that you live in now in Richmond could be built today for its actual market value? Like I live in a home that I bought for $299,000 in Yorktown. It's one of the two best school districts in East Central Indiana. 2007, I bought it for $299,000. It's just been assessed at $425,000 in nominal terms. It sold for $380,000 the year it was built in 1992. It would cost probably $700,000 to build today. That's the problem. And until the supply shrinks of those excess homes, that you're not going to get, or either because people move here and buy them and fix them up, or because they disappear into the earth, or they're bulldozed away, or taken off, done what Youngstown or New York or Detroit did, block off those blocks and say, we're going to eventually get to them, but you can't live here anymore, then you're not going to see it profitable to build homes. That's the public policy challenge.
So I just have a question. You talked greatly about the college graduates and how that is, they're mobile and they're looking for places for all kinds of reasons. What about, in addition to that, what about the mobile retiree that has expendable income, that really wants to live in a place that has that quality of life feel and those amenities? Is that another area that's worth targeting for a community from a growth perspective?
Absolutely, yes. I haven't published the study yet. But we did for Texas. Estimate of quality of life in Texas is 255 counties, and we looked at migration by age cohort. And so we tried to get families, but it's really hard to do because it's just people. So we looked at the 5 to 9-year-olds and the 10 to 14-year-olds. Huge quality of life effect in the migration of 5 to 14-year-olds. right? And that's because they're in families that are moving someplace. Quality of life, 18 to 24-year-olds, really low. They're picking the college to go to, or they're going to a job, and it doesn't matter. Quality of life doesn't matter to them, right? And quality of life doesn't appear really strongly until you get into your 30s. These are 5-year cohorts. It spikes for people aged 55 to 60, 60 to 65, 65 to 70, 70 to 75, and then drops off after that. So the two periods where people are most mobile looking for quality of life is when they have children in that, just about to start school till school is settled, the high school age, and then when they hit retirement age, a family 55 and older. So in terms of retirement places, those really matter. We looked at Texas that has a somewhat different climate distribution than here, but certainly the possibility of this being a place where people would like to retire is well, and just the fact is, the benefit of that is that, well, the average Hoosier is considerably older than the average American, so if you just want to keep people, it's going to have to be retirement oriented. Yes, sir.
I had a question. I look up this statistic. 21% of the population lives below the line of poverty here in Richmond. That's double the national average. What comments would you have about that?
If you're in a growing community, you don't worry about that, right? Because the people that are moving to your community, many of them are going to be under the poverty line. Like all grad students are under the poverty. I didn't know this. I was out of grad school. I was eligible for Medicaid for 4 years. I had no idea, right? So growing places, when I've done studies for growing places, they're enthusiastic. They should be enthusiastic about having a high poverty rate because most people are in poverty fewer than 5 years at a stretch and no more than 1 or 2 times in their lifetime. So having a high poverty rate in a growing place could mean that you're attracting people to labor markets and quality of life. So that's not a problem for a fast growing place. For a negative growing place or shrinking place, it could be a really big problem. It is less of a problem if it's immigrants, because immigrants tend to have only one generation or fewer of people in poverty. So the average immigrant in the United States, regardless of educational attainment, regardless of type of immigrant, is going to have a second generation effect that's substantially better than the incumbent population. So if a lot of your poverty rate's being driven by immigration, by people who are here and are poor and are working at someplace, and that's generally not a long-term problem. If it's mostly native-born Americans, it's a very deep problem. It is an acute and chronic problem because the likelihood of them escaping poverty at the level like that, if they're native-born Americans, is much lower. And if you have any doubt about it, I could take you to, I've been to every county in West Virginia and talked there where that's been a problem for now 70 years. So, yes, sir.
To segue off of the earlier concern regarding senior mobility, I know prior to COVID and the sort of chokehold it placed on senior mobility, there was concerns regarding the great senior sell-off, that is those 65 plus downsizing and perhaps adding to the housing surplus. Now that we're beginning our return to normal, is it forecast an event like that is still scheduled to take place, and are there forecasts out there regarding how that might affect Indiana's surplus housing?
All right, so the challenge will be if you have if you have not been growing like Richmond or Muncie, and you have a large baby boom. The last baby boomers turned 60 this year. And the oldest ones are 78, right? So they're at their half of the female baby boomers in that first year cohort will be dead this year, right? That population, as they move off, if there's been no replacement population in your community, you're going to have neighborhoods fall into stagnation. And a way to see that, if you don't believe me, next time you go to Muncie, go to Halteman Village. right, which was a big neighborhood built in the 60s. It's where all the professors lived. It's where all the, you know, it's a 1960s subdivision, and they're struggling to keep it together at this point because of that acute loss of households as the baby boomers retired. And so that is at risk for every place that's declining. So that's the argument for bringing more people in. That's the recurring sort of challenge. Nationwide, we have an excess supply of homes in the United States. There are 10 or 11 million extra homes in the United States. They're just not in the places anybody wants to live. So in the places that people want to live, there are not enough homes. In the places people don't want to live, there's a lot of extra homes because they never get destroyed. And you know, they're around forever. That's the fundamental challenge for a place that's been in population decline. I mean, so part of it's a good, their family sizes are smaller, so there's more homes, right? So there are more family units than there would have been with the equal population 40 years ago, but it still is it's a challenge at how do you right-side those markets without leaving large excess supply of housing. And it's for some, just to say, this is not a Richmond problem only, it's all over the Midwest. And it used to be in the East. I mean, the industrialized Northeast went through this 50, 60 years ago. That was Boston, all of Connecticut was a crummy, nasty, broken place 50, 60 years ago. In part because, and you don't see that in Europe very often, because those cities are 1,200, 1,800, 2,000, 8,000 years old. When was Richmond founded? All right, so pre-statehood. When did you hit 2,000 people?
Big growth was 1880s.
Right. So same, it's natural that we would see a lot of the economic reasons for places like this went away. The good news is that over the next century, we're going to add another 180 more million Americans, and they got to go somewhere. And they're probably not going to California, and they're probably not going to Maricopa County anymore. They're going to go somewhere else. They're going to be looking at places like this, if you have the right mix of things they want. Just because it's going to be very hard to fit them in those places. I thank you all very much. I know I threw a lot of data at you. The quiz will be in your email inbox later on today. I wish you luck today in wrestling with these problems. I don't have finite answers for all of these things, but in part, much of it is a political problem to talk through. And my goal here is for you to see a different way of thinking about moving your community forward that's based on the assets, nurturing the assets you have and improving the assets that would be more attractive, not just to residents who are here, but probably people who aren't here, but people who are here as well. So the quality of life is a people-focused activity, and that generally will mean helping people or improving the place for people that are here. And I thank you and good luck.